Okay, think about this for a second. You decide to reach out, grab your coffee mug. Seems simple, right?
Deceptively simple.
Yeah. But behind the scenes, your brain is running this incredible complex program, coordinating muscles, timing, all without you consciously thinking about every little step.
Exactly. And a huge part of that automated smooth control comes down to a set of structures deep inside the brain we're focusing on today, the basal ganglia.
Right, the basal ganglia. Now, we know you listening in as a first year MBBS student are probably swimming in neuroanatomy details right now.
Oh, absolutely. It can feel like a lot,
Yeah,
definitely.
really can. So think of this as our targeted exploration. We're gonna, zoom in on the basal ganglia.
We'll try to cut through some of the complexity.
Exactly. We're pulling from the kind of neuroanatomy texts you're using, aiming to give you a really clear, practical handle on what the basal ganglia do and why they matter clinically, all in about, say, 10 minutes.
That's the plan. A solid, concise overview you can actually use.
Right. So our mission is just that, give you that core understanding. Okay, so where do we start? How do the basal ganglia fit into the brain's whole system for movement?
Well, it helps to think about loops, feedback loops in the brain. You'll learn about the cerebellar loop, that's motor cortex to pons, then cerebellum back through the thalamus to the cortex, crucial for sort of fine-tuning movements as they happen.
Okay, like error correction on the fly.
Precisely. Now, the basal ganglia operate in a similar parallel loop. Motor cortex, basal ganglia, thalamus, back to the cortex. But their job is a bit different.
How so?
If the cerebellum is adjusting the strumming of a guitar in real time, you could say the basal ganglia are more involved in selecting the song to play in the first place, choosing and initiating the right motor program.
Ah, okay, selection and initiation. Got it. So for this basal ganglia loop, where does the information actually come in?
Good question. Essentially, all the input funnels into a structure called the striatum. Think of it like the main inbox.
The inbox, okay. And who's sending messages?
Well, primarily the motor and premotor cortex, which makes sense given the movement role. But critically, you also get dopamine signals coming in from a place called the substantia nigra pars compacta.
Dopamine, I know that's important.
Hugely important, especially for initiating movement. And there are also inputs from specific parts of the thalamus itself, the intralaminar nuclei.
Okay, so cortex, substantia nigra, thalamus, all feeding into the striatum. That's the in. What about the out? Where does the process signal go?
Right, so the output primarily leaves through two structures. The internal segment of the globus pallidus and another part of the substantia nigra, the pars reticulata.
Globus pallidus internal segment and substantia nigra pars reticulata.
Okay. And these output structures then mainly project back to the thalamus, specifically the VA and VL nuclei, the ventral anterior and ventral lateral. These thalamic nuclei then project strongly back up to the motor cortex. That's how the basal ganglia influence our voluntary actions.
Completing the loop.
Exactly. But the outputs also reach other parts of the thalamus, the brainstem reticular formation involved in posture and arousal, and even the tectum, which helps guide eye movements. So its influence is pretty widespread.
Okay, so we have the basic circuit, cortex striatum, globus pallidus, SNPR thalamus, VAVL, dial cortex. How does this circuit actually, control movement or cause problems when it goes wrong?
Well, the basal ganglia influence both the big motor systems, the lateral ones like the corticospinal tract for, say, fine finger movements, and the medial systems like reticulospinal tracts, which are more about posture and balance.
Right.
And a key concept is that the basal ganglia generally act to inhibit unwanted movements. They sort of put the brakes on competing motor programs, allowing the desired one to proceed smoothly.
Okay, inhibition is key. And this is where I guess the clinical side really starts to kick in for students like you listening. We hear a lot about movement disorders.
Absolutely. When that inhibitory output for the basal ganglia to the thalamus becomes excessive, becomes too strong, you get problems. This leads to symptoms like bradykinesia.
Slowness of movement.
Right. And hypokinesia, just reduced amount of movement overall. And akinesia, which is difficulty actually starting a movement.
And these terms are for issues higher up in the planning stage, not the final motor neuron signal itself.
Exactly. It's about the initiation and scaling of movement.
And the classic example here, the one you'll definitely encounter, is Parkinson's disease, isn't it?
It really is the textbook example. Parkinson's demonstrates so clearly what happens when the basal ganglia malfunction. The core symptoms, the bradykinesia, the rigidity, the tremor, the postural instability, these stem largely from the loss of those dopamine-producing neurons we mentioned earlier.
In the substantia nigra pars compacta.
Precisely. Remember, we said dopamine input to the striatum is critical. It helps balance the activity within the basal ganglia.
So lose the dopamine, lose the balance.
You got it. There are these two main pathways within the basal ganglia, the direct and indirect pathways. Very simplified, the direct pathway acts like a go signal, facilitating movement. The indirect pathway acts more like a stop signal, inhibiting movement. Go and stop.
Okay. Dopamine normally boosts the go pathway and dampens the stop pathway. So in Parkinson's, without enough dopamine, the stop pathway becomes overactive and the go pathway becomes underactive.
So too much stop, not enough go.
Essentially, yes. And the net result is increased inhibition flowing out from the basal ganglia to the thalamus. The thalamus then doesn't excite the motor cortex enough, leading to that slowness and difficulty initiating movement.
That really clarifies the mechanism behind the slowness. What about treatments like deep brain stimulation, DBS? How does that fit in?
Right, DBS. It's quite remarkable. Electrodes are implanted deep in the brain, often targeting the subthalamic nucleus, or that internal part of the globus pallidus.
The output structures or structures influencing them?
Exactly. And while we're still working out the precise mechanisms, the high-frequency stimulation seems to disrupt the abnormal, overly inhibitory signaling patterns. It effectively reduces that excessive braking signal going to the thalamus.
So it helps release the brake, in a way. That's a good way to think about it. It helps restore a better balance in the circuit, alleviating some motor symptoms.
Okay, so the role in body movement, Parkinson's, DBS, that's huge. But you mentioned earlier the influence is broader. Our textbooks hint at more than just walking and reaching.
Oh, definitely. It's not just about general body movements. The basal ganglia are also heavily involved in controlling eye movements, saccades, smooth pursuit. And they play really significant roles in cognitive functions.
Like what kind of cognitive functions?
Things like planning complex behaviors, decision-making, switching between tasks, even aspects of working memory. And beyond cognition, they're also tied into emotional regulation and motivation.
Wow. Eye movements, thinking, feeling.
Yeah.
How does the same basic loop manage all that?
It's about specialization through connections. Different parts of the basal ganglia connect with different parts of the cortex. So the circuits linked to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex are more involved in executive functions, planning. Circuits connected to, say, the anterior cingulate or orbitofrontal cortex are more involved in motivation, emotional processing, evaluating outcomes. For instance, there are projections from the orbitofrontal cortex key for reward and decision-making into the ventral part of the striatum. This suggests a role in linking our actions to potential rewards or consequences.
So the basic machinery is similar, but who it talks to in the cortex determines its specific job.
That's a great way to put it. Functional segregation within the loops.
So for us students thinking clinically, why is knowing this broader role important? It's not just about diagnosing Parkinson's tremors, right?
Absolutely not. Recognizing that basal ganglia problems can show up as cognitive shifts or changes in motivation or even eye movement issues is really important for a complete neurological assessment.
Can you give an example?
Sure. While something like hemineglect, difficulty attending to one side of space, is often linked to parietal lobe damage, you can sometimes see elements of it with certain thalamic or basal ganglia lesions that disrupt those wider attentional networks.
Interesting.
Or consider pure motor hemiparesis, weakness on one side. Often it localizes to the internal capsule or pons. But knowing the basal ganglia sit right there, influencing those pathways, adds another layer to your thinking. And even language networks connect with the basal ganglia. It's less common, but sometimes subcortical lesions there can contribute to aphasia-like symptoms.
So these structures are really deeply integrated into so much of what the brain does. Movement, thought, emotion.
They truly are central players, far more than just a motor relay. They initiate, regulate select movements, yes, but they also sculpt our cognitive processes and emotional responses through these parallel loops.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive. The basal ganglia crucial for starting and controlling movement, smoothing things out, suppressing what you don't want to do, but also key roles in eye movements, thinking, planning, feeling. A critical part of the brain's feedback system.
Couldn't have said it better. They connect intention to action, modulated by context and emotion.
Right. So here's a final thought for you to chew on as you continue your studies. Think about how maybe subtle variations or minor dysfunctions in these basal ganglia circuits, perhaps not dramatic enough to cause Parkinson's or Huntington's, might still influence everyday things like the flow of your thoughts or how easily you switch tasks, or maybe even nuances in emotional expression. Could tiny glitches here underlie some common experiences?
It's a fascinating question and highlights how much is still being discovered about these intricate circuits.
Definitely something to keep in mind as you learn more about the brain. This knowledge of the basal ganglia is foundational.
Absolutely. Keep building on it. Understanding this system is key to understanding a huge range of neurological conditions and really human behavior itself.